of executives and staff that we stand up to do nothing but focus on the response. And it was the record for TSA. Typically, we will have our critical incident management group stood up for several days, maybe a couple of weeks. We had this group actively in place for months because intellectually, I think all of us on this call have understood, what we may have to do when faced with a pandemic. We've certainly dealt with SARS in the past. We've certainly had H1N1. We were aware, of Ebola, 2 years ago. And so I think most of us probably had plans on the shelf for how we would deal with a pandemic, but there's certainly none of us, most of us on this call, I suspect were alive, during the last sort of worldwide pandemic, that we've experienced on this level. And so there was a number of things that we knew that we've never dealt with, and there would be issues that we had to face. And so for us internally, there was 2 things that we knew we had to establish very early on, 2 lines, if you would, that we would never cross, knowing that the decisions we would have to be making that we probably had no experience in dealing with. The very first thing is that we were not going to sacrifice our security mission. Whatever changes we put in place procedurally, whatever equipment we pursued, whatever policy decisions we took, we would never sacrifice our security mission because we recognize that once you start going down that road, you can't turn back. Okay, so that was the first bright red line that we knew we'd never cross, and we haven't. The second one is that knowing that even very early on, February and March of last year, when we really started dealing with this, with the pandemic, we knew there'd be, decisions that we'd have to make. And then we knew that if we reached a fork in the road and we had to turn left or turn right, we would always come down on the side of protecting our workforce and protecting the traveling public. And we were never going to sacrifice the public health of the people that were responsible for helping to make sure secure as they travel. And so, some of the very initial policy actions that we took actually caused a little bit of a ripple, here in the U.S. with the industry. And that was in February, we allowed our officers to voluntarily wear masks. At the time, people wearing masks was not something that was the norm. It's not something that you were hearing a lot about. But we knew that we were struggling with this. We knew that it became an issue out in California and parts of the U.S. We knew that we were dealing with it. There was very highly publicized outbreaks aboard cruise ships. So we were at the very early stages of dealing with this, and we made it voluntary. Anybody who wanted to wear their mask could do so. But then very quickly, we knew that we had to get very, very focused on how we can find, procure, and then deploy all PPE to our employees. And so quickly after that, we mandated the use of surgical masks, working with our chief medical officer and the Centers for Disease Control. We identified the type of masks that will be required in public areas where our officers are. And that became the surgical mask. And that was important for a couple of reasons. We knew that it protected our officers. And quite frankly, it protected the communities in which they operate. It really kind of helped blunt, the proliferation of the virus. And then very quickly from there, we began transitioning to this idea of how can we erect, acrylic or plexiglass shields to as a form of physical barrier. And so really those became the 2 most critical pieces of PPE that we had not deployed before. We'd always had our officers wear gloves. We always knew the importance of hand sanitizer and washing hands, but the 2 critical decisions for us was really the mandating of surgical masks as well as erecting these plexiglass shields. And then from there, we became very focused on what sort of policy or procedural changes could we put in place that would just help promote physical distancing. So we allowed, we made some variances. We put these on our websites to, how do we promote touchless security? And so we allowed officers to communicate with passengers, hey, go back out there and divest again, maybe come through the magnetometers again, anything that we could do to maintain our security mission and while preserving physical distancing became important. We got $54 million from our Congress by way of a supplemental, so extra money that was not included in our budget, just to focus on keeping checkpoints clean. We've already begun a process to where all 440 federalized airports, almost 2,300 screening lanes here in the U.S. are going to have plexiglass or acrylic shielding around our document check positions, around some of the search positions, and we've since mandated the use of face shields anytime we're giving a pat down. And so for any of you who happen to transit a U.S. airport, you're going to see TSA officers standing behind plexiglass shielding, wearing a surgical mask, and in some cases actually wearing a face shield as they perform a pat down. And then we talk a lot about technology, and I think in that respect, the technology that we were pursuing before the pandemic, the technology that we knew kept people more secure. The cutting edge technology that we knew was really going to allow our officers to find some of the security threats that we were worried about also happened to be those things that we know help promote physical distancing and touchless. So things like computed tomography, the latest generation of in-property technology is going to reduce bag checks. It's going to eventually allow people to keep more things in their bag. So we've known it is great for security and it is great for public health. Things like our CAT machines, our credential authentication technology, anything that, identifying that, yes, this passport, this driver's license is in fact real, and we have real instantaneous access, to flight reservations, all in an effort to keep the physical exchange of boarding documents from taking place. Is great for security and is great for public health. The EAIT, so the next generation AIT machines, those big boxes that you see in a number of airports around the world, how can we really move to a sleeker version, more of a panel view? How can we, pursue the next generation it's a smaller footprint? It's not going to require necessarily a passenger to stand in a closed box. How do we continue to push the envelope for how we can get good technology out there? We worked very closely and continue to do so with our industry. We continue to have a very high interest in, what is it that TSA is continuing to invest in? What is the next generation of technology? And so we continue to have a lot of interest in pursuing, again, the things that we knew were good for security also happen to be, very good for public safety. The question that we get asked a lot is, passenger travel, demand. This cuts across all modes of transportation, whether it's the cruise ship industry, to some of the passenger rail, to commuter rail, and certainly, to airports and airlines. And I think travel around the world has become a bit of a barometer, for how the world is dealing with this pandemic, certainly from a public health perspective, and also from a public confidence perspective. And so context is important here. This past summer, that's generally, here in the U.S., where it is really our 4 largest, highest volume travel days. And we really measure it from the beginning of summer to the end. We were on pace before the pandemic to come pretty close, I think, to almost 3 million passengers screened through our checkpoints domestically on some of our busiest days. The summer before last, we were routinely bumping up against 2.8 million passengers. So just the planned 4.5% growth, I think we'd have come awfully close to 3 million passengers. And then the pandemic hit. And so for us in the March-April timeframe, sort of in that lead up to the summer, our lowest volume day was 87,000 passengers traveling domestically. That's across 440 airports, almost 2,500 screening lanes, 87,000 passengers in the entire country. And to put that in perspective, our largest airports, Los Angeles International, JFK, Chicago, Miami, by themselves would exceed that on a usual day. And so we went from about 2.8 million over, the holidays to by February, March, April, almost at 1 million. All right, so if you sort of look at that, for how we started the summer to how we finished it, we are beginning to see, the industry recover a bit. Now, here in the U.S., it is mostly focused on domestic leisure travel. People that are going to the beaches, people that are going to the mountains, folks that are going on vacation, they're going on holiday. Any growth that we see is largely as a result of domestic leisure travel. International travel is still nowhere near where it was, nor is business travel. And we think that those will be the two most compelling factors that we have to contend with moving forward. And so we do expect domestically to have a relatively strong holiday travel season if the summer was indicative of what we can be experiencing, which is why really at this point we remain focused on continuing to, number one, make people as safe and secure as they can be going through our checkpoints. And we do that by working very closely with our airport, our industry, our passenger rail, all of our transportation partners domestically and around the world. And then secondly, I think once people are safe and secure, they're going to feel safe and secure, and then they'll feel more confident, to travel again. And so really, it really becomes a worldwide effort. We continue to have very strong partnerships with some of our international partners. Things, being able to do these things remotely is always a challenge, especially internationally. But we continue to focus on that because, again, this is something that is impacting the entire world. And it's through these partnerships I think we can all begin to recover from there. And so I think I'll stop there because I do want to check. I know I'm getting emailed the questions, and I do want to leave some time for conversation because it's extremely valuable for me to sort of hear, what your perspectives are. And so I have the questions here. I'll read them out loud. This is what we've set up here, and I'll give the answer. What kind of challenges do you think transportation will face in the near future? Hopefully, I laid those things out. In some of my opening comments, one of the things that we're going to have here is how do we begin to put forth, mitigation steps to allow for international, gateways to be established. At what point do we see business and international travel, begin to pick up? I think in a lot of respects, this is just so much about economically, where are folks going to be aside from, where we are with the pandemic. I think the vaccine, obviously that's going to be a pivot point. I think everyone acknowledges that once there's a vaccine and it's out, that begins, that begins the start of our journey to recovering. But effectively, the financial health of the industry, that's going to weigh on the minds of our international and our domestic partners. I think those are all just things, that we're going to have to continue to face, as an international community. And especially for TSA, one of the things that we have learned over almost 20 years, TSA has been in existence for almost 20 years. And what's really, really important for us, and something that I think we've learned over, our almost 2 decades of being around is, yes, we are a security and a regulatory agency, in the U.S. federal government, but we are also very much a part of the industry that we help regulate. There are, citizens and visitors go through our checkpoints. And so, yes, while we certainly understand and appreciate the regulatory, the security role that we play, we're also very much a part of the industry that we're helping to support. And so our continued focused work on these things together is where TSA is positioned. The second question, how can transport organizations continue to deal with the long-term impacts of COVID? I think chiefly for us, it's sharing best practices. One of the things that we did about 3.5 months ago is we stood up our Administrator Pekoski, as we began operationally to kind of get a handle on the pandemic, we began immediately looking towards how do we recover from this. We stood up a separate task force to go through everything from best practices to what is the latest research on, sanitizing bins. Anything from UV lights to next generation technology, We've had companies that have approached us about the use of canines, that can help detect COVID. These are not things that we should be hiding from each other. We publish our best practices widely to our industry. We share it with our international partners, and we've had the same in return. Like the extent to which all of us, if we find, best practices, we need to widely share those things that we can all learn from it. That makes passengers safe. It makes passengers feel safe, and it certainly, represents a unified effort. Whether it's internationally, a unified effort, certainly here domestically. What we don't want to have is that passengers and employees who work with our industry see a disjointed response. And I think that the best way we can help mitigate that is to really continue to share best practices with one another. What are the new threats which transport organizations face other than COVID? Well, I think some of the things that we've always been worried about continue to remain something that we're focused on. The insider threat. We've shared broadly and historically, our common concerns over the insider threat. Whether that's in the cyberspace, whether it's in physical space, and asking ourselves the question: how has that been exacerbated during this pandemic? Obviously the very nature of an insider is, employees that are trusted, employees that understand the system becoming, a threat. It's the very definition of an insider threat. And, we now have, companies around the world announcing, layoffs and furloughs. What is that doing to the emotional sort of health of employees around the world? So I think the insider threat continues to be, one of the things we continue to focus on. Again, it was something that we all collectively focused on before the pandemic. It's that which exists post-pandemic. UAV. How do we, counter, drones? That continues to be something that we're focused on. We've had experiences, more disruptive in nature, but if you look at the number of sort of instances in which, pilots and airports and, oil pipeline companies, there's every sector of transportation is having to understand how to deal with drones. There are certainly legitimate uses for UAVs, but how do we mitigate potential disruptions, from somebody who just thinks they want to get attention, or certainly somebody who may have, more nefarious intent? Continues to be something that we have to focus on. And that very much is along the same lines as sharing best practices. It's when you talk about technology, it's how do you detect this UAV? How do you continue to track it once you've detected it? And then from there, how do you mitigate it? Understanding that the type of environments these UAVs operate in is in the middle of cities potentially. It's in and around the legitimate use of airspace. And so those are all just very, very challenging problems for us to face. And in my discussions with my partners around the world, we have shared concerns and we have shared best practices for what we potentially could put in place to help mitigate this. And so I think the two things I'd highlight is continued focus on UAV, continued focus on the insider threat, and then overlaying all these things is a continued focus on cyber. Cyber continues to be something that governments and companies around the world, continue to face. It really requires a very, very technical capability and also very, very technical employees who really understand what this looks like. And so for us here at TSA, we have made cyber part of the curriculum across all of our employees, whether it's our employees who work on checkpoints, our employees who are our inspectors. Cyber is becoming the new constant in all of our training materials, just to kind of raise awareness in doing our official roles. What are the TSA goals in 2021? I tell you, we could have an hour-long discussion on that as a topic. I think we've always had, a number of goals. Internally for us, it's very, very important for our administrator to focus on our partnerships around the world. It's important that we stay focused on our employees. these things were always important. They're especially important in the middle of a pandemic when there are so many unknowns out there. Our ability to continue to communicate, our ability to continue to provide flexibility is going to be, all of any success we have is going to be predicated on, maintaining those communication lines and maintaining our flexibility, both internally with our employees and certainly with the industry that we help support. There's going to be a continued focus on technology. If we look, and I covered some of them, the very same technology that we knew, right, and that we, again, in our conversations around the world, there is a shared understanding of the basic pieces of technology that we know are going to help mitigate security concerns. Those very same pieces of technology also help mitigate public health concerns. So I think, looking at, as counterintuitive as it may be, how can we continue to make key investments in those technologies that are going to help, A, keep our industry secure, and B, help it recover from this pandemic? There remains, quite a bit of interest from our international and domestic airline partners to continue to work with us on pushing the envelope for developing technology. Any sort of research we're doing in this space continues to be a priority for us in terms of how we make key technology investments.